I mean, I love,
Okay.
and I mean also that his point about there being no sort of model of success in small and mid-sized cities
It's
is a
true.
great point. Yeah. Uh, how do you get
Yeah.
people on
Yeah.
board with something that they've never sort of experienced? Uh, all right,
Is
I
this
am
video
going.
too, or just sound? Just curious.
Um, we might as well do both. I mean, we could throw the video up. Like maybe we could
Okay.
consider kind of the video as a, I don't know, an ad thing. I mean, if it's not, if it's just sort of prepackaged. Oh, you're recording it now. Okay.
Shouldn't I be?
Yes, you should be. All right, I'm gonna start recording my.
Better than how I forgot to record that one time. So better to
Yeah,
catch more than none of it.
yeah. Um, okay, well, so we're starting on a bit of a new track here with our podcast. We're going to continue doing those sort of deep dives into issues,
Hmm.
um, and I think we were really sort of liking the feedback that we got on our last episode around the water up near Waverly, the Elmville water.
Yeah.
Uh, all the value added stuff that we threw in there with the writing and the photos and videos and all that sort of stuff, and sort of the long form with the podcast underpinning the whole thing. So we're going to continue doing that, but then we also thought that we would start doing a more regular podcast, a little bit short, a little bit more raw, uh, unedited with my sort of heavy hand.
Are
Um,
we allowed to swear in this one?
yeah, I
I need
think
to
we
know.
are.
I
I
think
Yeah.
okay, okay, just checking because I am a bit of a potty mouth.
Well,
Sorry to ruin my image to everybody else out there.
um, so the idea with this is that we'll sort of, go over the high notes a little bit more, and probably the low notes too, but of things that are
Highs and the lows.
happening. Yes, and
Yep.
everything in between. Everything. So little things that are happening in our area around Simcoe County. Also, sort of highlighting things that are happening with our member organizations, and we hope to have guests on from them in the
Mm-hmm.
future. And yeah, so, but first, actually, this is kind of like the first opportunity that we have to uh, talk a little bit about how we're experiencing this crazy, very interesting time that we're living through, the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
COVID-19.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, COVID-19 and 20 and 21.
Mm,
It's interesting that you use the word crazy, and I recognize that everybody's experiencing the same, but it
mm,
doesn't feel so crazy anymore, right?
mhm.
At the beginning, it was such a removal from normal that it felt kind of so abnormal, and now it just you kind of, this is normal now, right? And so I wonder on the other side of this if the return to whatever then starts to feel this is really weird. Like sometimes I watch movies and I'm like, that's not physical distancing. Like I don't like
Yeah,
you, I see things in it, and like I look at pictures of us as a family. I'm like, man, I remember we used to do that, and there was never really a consideration like extended family or whatnot. So it's kind of interesting that there's this new lens, and I wonder how much of this time I will miss on the other side of this, right? That I'll go,
yeah,
gosh, do you remember when it was nice that nobody really had anywhere to go? Again, I'm saying, not everybody, some people are looking forward to the other side of this. And I'm not saying I'm not, but at the same time, I don't see, this just has become normal for me now. So, and I think I will
yeah.
miss pieces of this.
Yeah, it's true. Seeing those little snippets of life before, and those dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
reckless rebels congregating in public areas. Uh, but
Yes.
it's, I've been struck by that too. It's a weird feeling. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but speaking of the crazy, like we were just talking about our frustration with the cold weather outside, it being
Yes.
early
The
May
cold.
and living in Canada, and our expectations that it'd be beautiful and warm and sunny outside, totally
Mm-hmm.
reasonable. But one of the things
Yeah.
that because I've been feeling that too, uh, and one of the things that, in terms of that experience of normalcy, I was sort of I'm kind of wondering if that has to do at all with the tension between sort of feeling the isolation, the confinement, and then, you know, wanting to get out and sort of have that release a little bit, and it not being as nice as you would like it to be. But I actually, you know, but when pressed on it, this is sort of an experience that I go through every year as well. I think probably most Canadians.
Except now you're a dog owner.
Yeah, I've been a dog
And when you're
owner.
a dog owner, it's quite different because I mean, like it's, you know, I own a husky mix, as you know, but not everybody that listens does. And so she doesn't give a shit whether it's
Mm-hmm.
-40 or, you know, well, she hates the warm actually. So she's like, I don't care. It's raining, it's snowing, it's really cold. Like strap on your snowshoes, let's go. And
Yeah.
I'm like, I hate the cold. And so like, even if it's like 20 degrees outside and there's a breeze, I'm like, whew, I could probably use like a thicker jacket. So
Yeah.
this has become a challenge, trying to navigate taking care of her and recognizing that it's like the US Postal Service, no, with the phrase about like no wind, no snow, like, yeah. So it definitely grates on you, but you feel an obligation to get out. So regardless of what it's like, you're just going, right? Regardless.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yep. And this is also, so the, everything started being thrown up in the air a little bit around the normalcy. There's a lot of topics that we're sort of keeping a close eye on as well. Like pretty early on in the pandemic, there started to be a conversation around density and whether or not it is a risk in terms of transmission. We've seen that. I think we've both been following that pretty closely because we both are pretty strong advocates of smart, you know, complete communities, which is also more densely built and things like that. So following that with a little bit of concern, and then measures that cities and towns can take. Some are taking, some are not taking. We just heard an interesting conversation on this on a webinar, which I guess we can get to pretty soon. But measures that are being taken to enable people to physically distance safely. So where, you know, sidewalks typically don't provide enough space, some jurisdictions are blocking off portions of streets to allow people to pass by each other safely, you know, walking out into the street and not having to sort of come into contact or conflict with traffic, these sorts of things. Mike, what are your thoughts on that? Well, let's start with the density part first.
Oh, geez, don't give me a broad question because you know I won't just stop talking.
Well, it is a pretty broad, yeah, it is very broad. But let's start maybe, let's start with the density question because that's a pretty important one, I think. And we're seeing it pushed almost like a concerted, organized effort. I suspect that's, you know, at least partially true, to push that narrative. But it's not a very strong argument when you dig into it a little bit. And one of the guests on the webinar that we were just watching has a great sort of phrase about that distinguishes between density and something else. You want to address that?
Density and crowding.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a difference between density and crowding, and crowding means people have enough space either within their community or within their home. You can have crowding in a rural setting as easily as you can in a urban setting. And one way to think of that is a undersized community center, right? A rural setting, you can maybe fit 50 people, you have an event and it's crowded and it's small and you can't really do anything in that community center of any consequence because there's just too many people and not enough space to be able to hold functions, that sort of thing. So you can have crowding in kind of any place, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you have density. And density also is kind of like people assume that all density is created equal. And that would be like saying, you know, I'm a big pasta fan, especially fettuccine Alfredo. So anybody that likes pasta and carbs like I do knows that not all fettuccine Alfredos are created equally. And so you have some great versions of density that are walkable. There's this green space that there's, people can access things like hardware stores and local shops, and they have places to go within their community. And then you can have densities that's just all high rises. And it's really just looking at the quantitative aspect of the community, like how many people you can stuff in a place, versus the qualitative side of it, which is how good is this place to house the number of people that we need to house. And so I think what we see in a lot of Canada is a very quantitative approach to density, which makes everybody go, ugh, density is awful. It's like going to the worst Italian restaurant in your neighborhood and going, ooh, whoever likes Italian food, but really you just got bad Italian food, right? If you went to another place, you might actually really like it. So that's kind of the thing. And that makes the density conversation really difficult, because our experience in most of Canada is a rural or suburban kind of experience, and density comes with the big bad cities. And even the big bad cities and even the more suburban areas really just don't understand how to make density look nice, feel nice to be into. If you then look at other examples of density, like places in Europe or even Latin America, density doesn't feel crowded. It feels like there's people around for sure, but there's also space. There's also areas where you're not having to feel crammed. And I find that a lot of what we see here is density that feels crowded and crammed and overpowering, almost like the big towers and everything are looking over you. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the arguments that are being pushed out there are pointing to the fact that a place like New York City is sort of the center of the outbreak in the US. And of course, New York City is relatively dense. But those arguments also ignore the fact that there are areas in the world, such as Seoul, South Korea, to name one. There's plenty others that are considerably more dense than New York City, which have been very successful in countering the transmission of the virus. So it has more to do, I think, with how space is organized and the relationships that are facilitated by that organization. I mean, as you were talking there, I was thinking I'm a big fan of a podcast called The War on Cars, and it's titled "Intentionally Provocative" out there for you who are screaming and raging. Although I guess probably most people listen to this.
Don't take me from my SUV.
Yeah, but yeah. Really, it's looking at the role that cars play in our culture, in our society, and one of the things that they highlight is the amount of space that we give to cars. So, I mean, in terms of crowding, as a pedestrian or on a bicycle, you can feel quite crowded, even though there's a ton of space around you. And so, I think many people listening to this who are in our area will recognize a lot of this space. I live near a number of roads, really, they're almost all around, but where you'll have like two lanes of traffic going either direction, and then you'll have a center turn lane. And that center turn lane, I mean, first of all, those 2 lanes in either direction, 4 lanes total, well, 5 lanes with the center, really for the volume of traffic aren't needed. They're based on the assumption that they'll be needed in the future, which is shitty design if you ask me. But the center, and even worse, exactly like highlighting the shitty design of it, planning of it, the center turn lane exists throughout the stretch of the road, even in areas where there's no option to turn anywhere. There's no use for it. So back to the point that I was making, if you're a pedestrian or a cyclist on some of these roads now, they're starting to put sharrows. You'll be on these things, and you'll definitely feel under pressure in terms of the amount of space that you have. But there's tons of space around you. It's just it's kind of given to uses which aren't useful, really.
Well, it's lack of space for people by design. Really, it's not. another way to flip it, instead of saying we give a lot of space to cars, is to say we intentionally don't give a lot of space to people.
Right.
And so, and goes back to another thing we were saying about density and COVID. Really underpinning that as well is the amount of inequity in the community.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see kind of boroughs of New York City are not responding the same way as others are. And
Mm-hmm.
areas where there is more inequity and more poverty is responding a lot differently than maybe others. And even in some of the suburban communities where there's inequity issues, or inequity doesn't always necessarily mean poverty. In a sense, it can also mean unequal access to get to healthcare or to services or whatever. So, broadening that scope of it, you can start to see that how inequitable community also kind of impacts its response. So looking at like, my mom's a senior, she's almost 80, and thinking about the amount of space that is given to her, or children really that kind of move at a slower pace, that maybe aren't as aware of their surroundings, you start to see that when you feel crowded and pressured, it's again by design, because maybe you need a walker or you have a stroller that you're taking your kids down the street and the sidewalks are narrow. Why the sidewalks narrow? Well, there's no rule saying that sidewalks can only be a certain size. That was a design feature that they decided to only make it a certain size. You could take a whole a square and make it just pedestrian friendly, but you've made it a very small size so that people that would use the sidewalk and that would get out into their community in a place that's considered more dense really don't feel welcome. And then that kind of precipitates into, I don't get outside, I don't meet my community feels crowded, because whenever I go on the frickin' sidewalk, I have to pull onto the grass to let someone else go by because I've got a stroller and they've got a bike. And, that is the kind of stuff, those daily grinds that make your city or community feel like there's not enough. So all of that kind of grows into it. And that's not the fault of having an apartment building in your neighborhood. That's the fault of not including enough space for the people that are going in the apartment building, and giving it to mostly cars or vehicles, right?
Right. Yeah, I want to just mention that to people listening, the resources that we mention on here, we'll post links to on the episode page for this. So you can head to our website, simcoecountygreenbelt.ca, and find links. The link that, so the webinar that I was just mentioning was put on by Parachute, which actually I was unfamiliar with prior to this webinar. Had you known about Parachute?
Yeah, but I don't want to make you feel bad.
Okay, all right. Anyways, we'll put the link up on our website. There's a recording of the webinar. It's a Zoomcast, and so you can find it and watch it. It's excellent. And the attendees, let me see here, the panelists were Bartek Komorowski, planning advisor, road safety and human behavior for City of Montreal. Linda Rothman, assistant professor.
That's a title.
Yeah. Linda Rothman, assistant professor, School of Occupational and Public Health, Ryerson University, and Margaret's one of Margaret's favorite thinkers on urbanism, Brent Todarian, urban design and planning consultant, Todarian Urban Works. He's based out of Vancouver, but he does work all over the world. Yeah, really excellent podcast. Definitely worth checking out. It's webinar. They kept it relatively short, which is going to be a challenge for Margaret and I here, right? So,
yes.
we usually kind of unleash the hordes, or the horde hope to.
Yes. One thing I want to just pick up on here is that some people, when they hear the word Greenbelt, they think about obviously Ontario's Greenbelt, and then they wonder why you and I would be talking about equity in communities, why we're talking about sidewalks and community design and everything else. And funny enough, my oldest decided he has to do this Genius Hour project, and decided to do it on the Greenbelt. I don't know where he got that inspiration from. I didn't tell him to, by the way, but he just decided to do it. But interestingly, he wanted to really get into the history. And so I knew some of the stuff, like, for example, green belts are all over the world. Ontario has a provincial green belt, but there's also regional green belts, like Ottawa has one and Waterloo has one. And even, in fact, there is a small green belt between the city of Barrie and the township of Springwater. So green belts, but as we're getting to the history, was learning that, green belts, meaning areas where development wasn't supposed to go and were going to be kept in kind of some natural form, have been used as far back as the Roman Empire. And they were a way to help ensure that people, whether they lived in cities or rural communities, one, had access to nature, but also constrained growth in a way that didn't impact on farmland and nature and water to the detriment of the people. So London has one of the oldest green belts around its city. Berlin has a really cool one because its green belt actually is where the Iron Curtain used to be. So green belts actually can play into urban design. They play into the overall health of a community. And it's really hard to talk about green belts without getting into what they can provide for the community as far as equity, access to nature, clean air, water, now climate benefits as well. But also the other side of that coin is, how does that then affect the quality of the community that's impacted by the green belt? So it's really hard to not talk about one without the other, because they're kind of like two sides of the same coin, right? So I just wanted to kind of put that out there, because I feel sometimes that people are like, you're greenbelt people, why are you talking about community design? And really, a greenbelt is a very old solution that has been proven time and time again to work. But everybody thinks it's this new radical idea, and it really has, it's really not.
Right, and the catalyst for the Greenbelt in Ontario had to do with the sort of outward pressure happening from urban areas, particularly specifically Toronto, the GTA, and the impacts of that on natural heritage, including the agricultural system, and I mean that's a key attribute of the Greenbelt as well, is it enhances food security, right, which is a big topic now. Going forward, I meant to pull up a number of resources because I keep on seeing them pop up here and there of sort of concerns, stories about the impact that this has had on the supply chain. There's meat plants shutting down, things like that for because of transmission in there. But then there's also just like things have clogged up, because with a long supply chain, you kind of need everything to continue functioning smoothly. If there's a cinch point anywhere, it backs up real quick, and it's hard to free that. I did a fair bit of my educational background had to do with disaster preparedness and planning. I actually TA'd a fourth year course in it as well in grad school. And I mean, one of the key attributes of a stable system or a resilient system is it's decentralized, it's spread out. Whereas a more brittle structure is top down, very hierarchical. If you cut off the head, it's done, right? Everything falls apart. And as far as food security goes, this is really big. This is going to be a pretty big impact coming up. Food prices are going to rise. They're having a lot of trouble getting people in the fields to be able to sort of plant, and that's going to probably continue for a while.
Yeah.
So we're going to see a big sort of sticker shock in the grocery markets. And so we recently saw the provincial government come out and say that community gardens are now what they were deemed an essential service. And allowed to reopen, and there's a nascent organizing effort in Barrie around backyard gardens. Brampton, actually, where former Barrie City Councillor Patrick Brown is now mayor, has been doing a lot with backyard gardens and supporting people who want to do that. So sort of decentralizing that, encouraging people to be able to grow their own food, and then supporting local agriculture in the surrounding in the area surrounding urban centers is crucial for our food security and for our resilience going forward. Not only are you increasing the number of options in terms of food supply, but you're plowing that money back into your local economy. We talk about this a lot as a rationale behind the Greenbelt and how it supports agriculture, specifically local agriculture. Yeah. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And two things that I was told a while ago, which really sometimes can keep me up at nights, and I probably shouldn't add to the anxiety of everybody that's listening. But Ontario Farmland Trust did a study, gosh, I'm going to say like 6-7 years ago. And at the time, we were losing like 175 acres of farmland a day in Canada, mostly to urban use. And they had projected that if that farmland trend, that loss continues, that by 2031, Canada would not have enough farmland to feed itself, to be completely sustainable and not reliant on imports. Now, mind you, we do a lot of importing in food, but we wouldn't have the land base to change that if things didn't change. We have gone down a little bit. I think we're just over 100 acres a day. I'm going to say like 120, 115. Anyways, it's over 100 acres a day, so it's reduced. So that window's probably lengthened a little bit. So that's one thing. But the other thing, a farmer and an agronomist, I believe was his name, talked to me about, someone who studies kind of like agriculture and the economics of agriculture, and I believe also a little bit of the soil as well. Sorry, apologies to agronomists if I got your job wrong. But anyways, they were saying like the topsoil in farmland, you know, that's a process that took 150, 200 years to develop. And so he said to me, whenever you go to the garden center and you buy topsoil in a bag, realize that came from somewhere that was destroyed. That wasn't just, you know, you don't just go somewhere and go, oh, there's a huge topsoil deposit way down where else. Because whenever they take over farmland for urban uses, they scrape down like several feet, and all of that goes. And then they put, you know, sand, gravel, whatever else to build like a base, right? So that dirt has to go somewhere, and that dirt just can't be replaced. So you need to be thinking about when we lose farmland and we lose that topsoil, sure, you can probably, you know, add manure to something and you can re-nourish the soil for sure. But that's not just an immediate process, right? That all of a sudden any piece of land in Canada is able to grow any type of crop we want. That's really not the reality. And so, you know, just thinking about the loss of that and how it's not recoverable, not immediately, right? Yeah. So those are kind of some things that I think about, and that's partially why there's a lot of reasons why we support like kind of the Greenbelt expansion, but it's also to say farmland, regardless of what it grows now, we need to keep that because it is a finite resource, similar to water, similar to green space. These things aren't infinite. They aren't replaceable. Once they're gone and they're covered over with pavement and concrete, to recapture them and reclaim them back to its natural form, to give them the same function that they were doing, it's impossible. Sure, you can put a couple trees on it and makes it looks nice and you've rehabilitated it, as they say, but does it do the exact same function with the same amount of habitat? No, never. It doesn't, right? And people need to recognize that when you've lost it, it's actually gone.
Yeah. All right. So we're
to depress everybody some more.
We're coming up to half an hour here, so I'm gonna try and move it along.
Holy crap!
I know.
Stop talking so much.
Time flies. Back to just to point out though that if people are interested in that organizing effort happening in Barrie around backyard gardening, it is a Facebook group called Barrie Urban Gardeners. You can find them at that on Facebook, and so that's very cool. A couple of things that I wanted to touch on quickly, and specifically around the options part that we were just talking about with food security and local agriculture, also is, and looping it back to the jurisdictions that are providing more space, specifically sort of closing off portions of streets and things like that for pedestrians and cyclists to be able to physically distance safely. There was talk on this webinar that we referenced earlier from Parachute about the short-term and long-term possibilities of doing that. And so I wanted to kind of hit a couple of things. In Barrie, for instance, where I live, we're not as compact a community. So in terms of space, there's a little bit more space. I still don't think it's safe. I often, when I'm out walking the dog or biking around with my kids, I often do have to go out onto the street to pass by other people. It's not as bad as I think it would be downtown Toronto or places like that. So the immediate need for that physical distancing isn't necessarily as urgent here. I still think it's present, but I also think that there's a really important case to be made for doing this in terms of the long-term needs of our communities. A couple of reasons for that being that it's possible, I know there's sort of arguments back and forth, but it's possible that the way that we work is going to change as a result of this pandemic. More people working from home and whatnot, which changes the demand for our street use. So recognizing that but I think the more important thing in terms of the options available is providing those options to people, those options of being able to get to the grocery store, which is a problem in a suburban, as you mentioned, in a suburban neighborhood. It's effectively built so that you rely on your car to get your basic amenities, and that's a huge vulnerability. So if
Absolutely.
for whatever reason you're not able to use your car to get somewhere, if there's a washout on a road or some other sort of natural disaster happens or what have you, you're stuck. You're in trouble, right? So providing, I know a washout that you're not going to be able to get past that on your, by walking or taking your bike either. But so bad example. But regardless,
no, but it is. I mean, you could possibly. Better than you could in a car. Let's put it that way.
Right, perhaps. But there's other examples of why you might not be able to use your car, and providing people with options is the core of building resilience in communities. And we need options. We need those resilient characteristics in our communities, because we know what's coming down the pipeline is not going to be good, right? One of the things that I appreciated about the webinar also was they characterized what we're going through right now as a dress rehearsal for the impacts of climate change. And it's true. And cities that recognize this as a lesson and learn from that and implement policies, make decisions based around those lessons are going to be better suited to confront those impacts. And they're acting in the best interest of their public doing so. So that's a really key thing. So there's that long-term framing, that long-term way of looking at the decisions that can be made now. They might not be immediately necessary to address the challenges of COVID-19, but chances are there's a pretty strong case that they'll be necessary to address the challenges of climate change.
Well, and I think too that the one point that was made by Brent Todarian was that the communities that are used to experimenting and trying something new are more likely to continue to do so as old ways of doing things are no longer viable options. So right now, nobody is expecting normal. Nobody's expecting what happened in last May. So if the roads are being used differently, if people are accessing nature differently, now is the time to experiment, because one of the issues with trying something new was nobody wanted to leave the comfort of now. There is no comfort of now, right? People are looking forward. So they're not going to mind as much that you're making more space for bikes on roads, because they're using their bikes more often, they're home more often. They're like, this is what it's like, because there's no need to keep the status quo right now. It's pretty much thrown out the window. And as you were saying with with climate change, there will be no normal that we can project into. So like 2025 might not look anything like 2026, and the seasons and the precipitation and all of that sort of thing will be different and will require creative solutions. So if your municipality, if your neighborhood group isn't willing to experiment and try something new now, when will be the right time? When you absolutely are forced to, you have no option. That's not resiliency, right?
Yeah. So we need to wrap this up because we're as usual, we're stretching things on a little bit long here. Is there anything
we're terrible.
Anything you want to link to or sort of direct people to as being interesting resources?
No, but can I just throw to something else quickly? You're gonna hate me for this. So we were kind of talking about like, there is no new normal. We got to think about what happens next. And I think as we follow through those stages of grief, there comes the acceptance and then the building new. And something that you and I are involved in that's just kind of started to kind of launch into probably the next week's topic. We'll be talking a little bit more about this, is we're kind of looking already at what does post-COVID look like? What are some of the opportunities municipalities can build into their long-term planning, that community groups can put into their long-term planning, that actually makes our communities better and equitable and addresses that qualitative issue that we're having problems with, and we're seeing kind of stripped bare in across the globe. So I'm kind of excited about that, to figure out how to make a plan with others and other stakeholders. And, there's forces out there that are wanting to very much go back to, let's prioritize cars, let's prioritize profits of developers, let's prioritize housing over farmland, over water, over community safety. They are already working very hard to get that message out. And I have no issue with providing homes for people, but we need to be looking at the types of homes that we need that are equitable, that actually are affordable, and not just because they're a certain percentage of a median income of whatever, like, we need to start addressing those kind of things for our seniors and for low-income people. So it's really an interesting kind of thing, a thought project to kind of get into, to say, okay, how can we make things better, and how can we launch into something better? Like you were saying about resiliencies, about being able to bounce. Yeah, so that's something that I just wanted to kind of throw out there, that we might be talking about going forward.
Yeah, great. I had a whole bunch of links I'd saved, but I think, I mean, most of them have to do with how certain jurisdictions are taking action, and I had some thoughts on how others are not taking action, which I've sort of touched on a little bit. I wish there was more action being taken in our area. There doesn't seem to be. It seems to be more sort of status quo, sort of measures taken to address COVID-19, but not really sort of taking the extra steps beyond that to improve the community. One thing that I did want to mention, which
sorry, just one.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, a research project for those that are listening that have gotten through our droning on for this long, is if you're thinking about your community and wanting to make it better, and maybe your municipality isn't leaders as you want, look up tactical urbanism. And I don't know, just throw that out there. I'm not going to define it for you. Just go look into tactical urbanism and see some examples, and then maybe that might inspire you a little bit.
Yeah, cool. Another great resource is a podcast from the Overhead Wire. It's called the Talking Headways podcast, which I have been absolutely loving. there is an episode that is focused on the Slow Streets Initiative in Oakland, which was pretty quick out of the gate with providing more spaces for their citizens. And it's really fantastic. And one of the things that they go into on the episode, I'll provide a link to it on the page for this, is how the town, how the city engages with the community. And it's really cool. It's pretty proactive. We found some other examples of it as well. We're talking to a few people from some jurisdictions where they're doing other interesting things. We hope to have them on future podcasts, but it's very early going, so fingers crossed for that. Anyways, let's wrap up. We're hitting the 40-minute mark here, I think. So
all right.
Okay. Yeah.
Shall we?
So stay safe out there, everyone. And we'll in the future going forward, I think we'll try and orient this more toward sort of local issues, what's going on the ground here, as we said. Look forward to doing that.
Stay safe, everybody.
Take care.